Good morning. It is currently 6:32 a.m. on Friday, March 13th, 2015. Ooh, Friday the 13th. I'm Christiana Ellis and I just got up. This is 5 more minutes. I am extra tired today because for whatever reason Luna was just really restless last night and she kept me awake. And it was, I think, not just her. I think that neighbors were making noises later into the night than they typically would, and they were noises that I probably wouldn't have had any problem with uh, going to sleep, but Luna, laying on the bed next to me, kept going, and that definitely kept me awake. Anyway, sorry, I'm tired and distracted. I was going to talk about something different today, but yesterday we got the news that Terry Pratchett, author of the Discworld series, among others, had died. And so I thought I would talk a little bit about that instead. The Discworld series, Terry Pratchett as an author, and the Discworld series in particular, certainly what he's best known for, mean a lot to me. I discovered him in high school. I had already read the entire, sorry, I feel like I'm really out of it this morning. I'd already read the entire Hitchhiker's Guide series, and so my introduction to the idea that science fiction or fantasy could also be funny was already in place. And I can't 100% remember whether I think the first Discworld book I read must have been Small Gods, but followed closely thereafter by Pyramids, and since then I have read almost all of them, which is a lot. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but definitely more than 30. In a lot of ways, I feel like the humorous fantasy of Terry Pratchett is one of those things in the world that has formed part of the base level part of my personality. I really believe that it's not just books that I enjoyed, but it has become part of who I am and how I see the world. And a good example of that, I think, is just a little bit from Pyramids, which is one of the earliest Discworld novels. I think it's in the first 4 or 5. And it just always stood out to me and ended up being very helpful for me in a number of respects. And it's a simple bit where the protagonist, I'm chewing on plastic stuff, the protagonist has gone into the desert and he finds a bunch of philosophers firing arrows at tortoises and killing them. And then they talk about there's supposed to be a philosophical paradox that if you fire an arrow at a tortoise that's walking away from you, by the time the arrow reaches where the tortoise was when you fired it, the tortoise has then moved on a little bit. And so then by the time the arrow gets to that point, the tortoise has moved on from there. And so even though the arrow is going much faster than the tortoise, it seems like how could it ever actually reach the tortoise? Because every time it reaches the point where the tortoise had been, the tortoise has moved on. Even if they get infinitesimally, infinitely closer and closer and closer, they will never actually reach for that reason. And yet, the philosophers trying to prove this theory were getting very frustrated because every time they fired the arrow, it actually just killed the tortoise, and they were getting angry that it disproved their theory. And that just always made me laugh. But also it it was meaningful in a number of ways to me. First of all, it showed me, or it illustrated the point that you can logic your way into some real nonsense, and that sometimes things might be complex and frustrating that you can't understand what's happening, and yet you can still see what's happening. So, for example, for them to get so upset, they don't understand how they don't see where the flaw in their logic is, and yet the arrows are clearly hitting the tortoise. And so maybe that should be evidence that their theory, as fancy and as impressive as it is in their heads, has some problems if the actual practical demonstration just completely blows it out of the water. And that's part of what appeals to the engineering nature in my head, is that, you know, at some point you can just say, well, clearly the idea that the arrow will never hit the tortoise is incorrect, because it does hit the tortoise. And so you need to start working on a theory that explains why that would be, instead of continuing to insist that you must have fired the arrow wrong. But then it also, once I got into my senior year of high school, started taking calculus, I realized that that's actually the mathematical answer to this paradox, which is a real paradox. It's known as Zeno's paradox. You can look it up if you want, but just the idea that it's a convergent series, and if you integrate it to infinity, it equals 1, and the arrow hits the tortoise. Sometimes it's portrayed as Achilles chasing a tortoise as well. All right, I'm over 5 minutes already, but I don't know what else to say about Terry Pratchett. I did get to see him in person once. I didn't meet him exactly, but when I went to Worldcon in Glasgow, I got to hear him read from Thud, which was the Discworld novel that was on the horizon to come out. And that was really special. I have this edition of Soul Music, which is one of my favorite Discworld novels. That I bought this one in London when I went there. Terry Pratchett was amazing, and if you haven't, you should read his books. Alright, I think that's all I got for today, but remember, you can find all my stuff at Christiana Ellis and ChristianaEllis.com. I'm at Christiana Ellis on Twitter, and I'll talk to you tomorrow for 5 more minutes.